Hello, everyone, and welcome to Video Games Are the Worst Thing on Earth, the only podcast that tells you the truth about video games. I'm Reese, and we're doing something a little different this podcast. Alton's not here. He refused to participate because he didn't want to watch Ready Player One, the subject of this podcast. Instead, I've brought along my buddy, Seth Goldsmith, eminent podcaster, and also writer of the film Night Owls, an excellent film that was once available on Netflix, but I don't know how you watch it now. Seth, say hello.
Hello. You can watch Night Owls on iTunes, and we'll actually make money from it. So do that, guys.
Yeah, watch it on iTunes, you pirating bastards.
It's a tiny little movie. Please don't pirate it. It has definitely been pirated. We've seen it on Pirate Bay, which is fine.
It's a great movie.
Legitimately. Thank you.
So yeah, but we're not here to talk about Seth's movie. We're here to talk about Ready Player One. So
I was led to believe we're just going to talk about Night Owls for
we tell a lot of lies to get the guests on. Welcome to the truth. I want to do like a plot synopsis real quick, but first what's your general impression of Ready Player One, Seth?
Okay, well, I never read the book because it seemed like hot garbage. I mean, and I've read plenty of takedowns of the book, which is maybe unfair, but I feel like I understand what that book is. And so the movie is kind of a crazy mess. I saw it on 70 millimeter at the Alamo Draft House on a Friday afternoon. It was a packed house full of excited nerds. The guy next to me started laughing the moment Van Halen played over the opening credits. I was like, oh. So I rolled my eyes kind of at that kind of, the whole knowing pop culture reference stuff just does not do it for me. But I think there's something more to the movie than the book and source material, but I'm not sure I'm right about that. And that's kind of what I feel like we're going to talk about today. You know what I mean?
100%. I think we've got similar kind of ideas behind it. I find it to be a very well-crafted movie. Spielberg remains the master, and there's charming parts to it. Like I totally understand that. I understand why people like it, and not everybody has my specific malaise when it comes to the world. They have capacity for joy, and I understand that why this movie makes them feel it. So I want to do a really rough plot rundown. I don't think the plot is so important that we have to do like the thing sometimes people do, where you like take a journey through the movie and act.
Sure.
But it's roughly about this dude named Wade Watts in a slum in Ohio that. The way he explained it is we ruined the world because we stopped caring about our problems and we instead just tried to escape them. It's not entirely explained how we ruined the world, but what everybody does now is they exist in this massive virtual reality world called the Oasis. And people do everything in the Oasis, and they only log off if they have to take a shit or sleep. And that is kind of portrayed as both a good thing and a bad thing. The leader, the creator, I should say, who is kind of worshipped like a god, whose name is Halliday. I forget his first name.
It's James Halliday, played by British thespian Mark Rylance, doing his best impression of Garth Algar, which is one of the most delightful things about the movie, I think.
So the plot of the movie is this quest. Halliday has died, and he's left these 3 keys, and if you can find all 3 keys, you get control over the Oasis, $500 billion, who knows what else, a bunch of other shit. Wade Watts and his crew are called Gunters, egg hunters.
Sorry. Anyway.
No, I mean, I feel it needs to be underscored for people who haven't seen the movie. It's something you hear a couple of times, is the word Gunter as something that's you're supposed to take
it's also they make a big deal of the fact that Wade is not clanned up, as they say.
Yeah.
He has no clan, but he plays with the same best friend every day, and there's 2 other people who are basically his clan, even though he says it's, and I guess his arc is supposed to be about learning to work with other people, but he already does. it's a very confused movie. So
So as it goes through, the challenge is kind of you have to figure out the puzzles by researching Halliday's life, and you get little clues as how to where the key might be, or little tricks that you need to defeat them. And there is an arc as they go through it, but roughly is the first one is that there's like a big race through New York City, and then there's a big sequence where they go through The Shining, and the third one is they have to play Atari on a glacier, but that's less the focus, and there's like a big battle between them and the antagonist, who is I know that their army is called the Sixers. IO, is that the name of the company?
IOI, yeah, they're like the evil company,
Mm-hmm.
and this other company is apparently not evil. They're the Oasis is not an evil company. They're a giant corporation worth $500 billion, but IOI, they're bad because they're going to put ads in the game or something like that.
Well, to be fair, IOI does have VR slavery, which I think is bad. But it's really like I do agree with you that it's kind of weird that the movie it does portray that as being bad, but it's worse that they want to put ads in the game, and it's worse that they're fake gamers, that they don't understand the 80s references, etc. And we'll get into a little bit more of that in a second.
Yes. Another delight of this movie, though, I'd say, is Ben Mendelsohn's performance as the head of IOI, the hater who's not he's a fake gamer, but he is just a great bad guy as always.
I definitely think Ben Mendelsohn and the guy who plays Halliday are the two probably best performances in the film.
For sure.
And definitely not T.J. Miller, who adds a kind of ugly Paul to the whole thing, but
sort of makes sense, though, right? He's supposed to be the kind of the bad asshole, gamer, right? It's almost like the perfect casting in a way.
I certainly agree that it heightens the experience of just totally loathing everything about who the bad guys are.
Right.
In the end, they figure out some way. We're going to get into that a little bit more. But the first thing I want to talk about in terms of doing this deep dive, well, before that, do you think I missed anything important in terms of...
No, I mean, it's a pretty standard hero's journey. I think the big thing with Ready Player One as a book and movie is just everything is pop culture references. It's this unending... There's a line early on where say the limit is your imagination, except nobody imagines original things. They're all playing as characters from 80s pop culture mostly, but also some 90s and 70s. And you'll see Batman, you'll see the Millennium Falcon, you'll see the old Batmobile, the DeLorean from Back to the Future. But that's kind of like the biggest thing about this movie. It's like very pop culture heavy without having much depth to what each piece of pop culture actually means.
I would agree wholeheartedly. That was the first thing I wanted to talk about, because that's the surface of the movie. Even above the story is, look, there's Tracer from Overwatch. Look, there's Godzilla. Look, there's Chappie.
Wait, Chappie appears in this movie? I missed Chappie.
I have read in multiple places that Chappie is in the Battle Royale. I have not been able to see him in it, and I don't want to talk about how much time I spent combing through that sequence looking for Chappie. If you know where Chappie is, listeners, at us immediately.
I am starting a new podcast called Chappie Trap House, so it's about robot socialist bros.
So yeah, and it's just endless, and it's a story element too, because it's clear that the bad guy Ben Mendelsohn is like a fake gamer bro. He has somebody in like one of the scenes of the movie. He has an earpiece where one of the nerds are explaining the different references to him, which has, I believe that scene has the worst line, which in A Player Knows a Hater, which was incredibly cringy. But I wanted to talk about the references in general, but specifically what I think to be the worst reference, which is the infamous Iron Giant beat in the film, and also the second challenge, which I think is the best reference. So I don't know, what's your take on the Iron Giant having a gun thing?
The Iron Giant is one of my favorite movies. I'd cry just thinking about that movie, and he famously the entire point of the movie is people think he's a weapon. Nobody knows if he's built by the Russians or he's from space. It's like takes place in the 50s, and it's about that kind of paranoia. And he famously says, "I am not a gun." So in this movie, he just has a giant arm gun and is blasting the bad guys away. And there's really no connection to the original character. And I don't think the Iron Giant's in the book, but I could be wrong. It seems like more of a Spielberg loved that movie, maybe. It's buds with Brad Bird. So I don't know exactly how that. I could be wrong. Maybe it's in the book.
We're going to pretend that the book doesn't really exist here,
Sure,
because
sure.
I'm not going to read it either. I've heard some things about it. To me, I'm only interested in this as a Spielberg movie.
For like I said, I've read a bunch of think pieces about how it's the worst book ever written, and like what's so offensive and wrong about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's changes that were made from what I've read, between seeing the movie and reading a few pieces about the book, that make the movie at least a little more interesting and a little less surface than what the book seems to be. And so that's the tension I'm sort of interested in without wanting to read 300 pages of garbage.
I would agree with that, and I think that it's worth, it's worth pointing out that there is more craft and thought put into the movie. Like, I haven't read it, but I've read those same takedowns probably, and it just seems like it's very gatekeeping oriented, and it doesn't elevate it in the way that I would say this movie is at least making attempts to do at certain points. And just to get back to the Iron Giant thing specifically, is that to me, it having that was already enough to have it be a pretty big thumbs down. And it's just, my understanding is that Iron Giant was made because Brad Bird's a family member died from gun violence. So it was very specifically, a very personal moment for him to say that, maybe we should reconsider what these weapons do to our lives. And to have the movie just have a triumphant, just, hell yeah, the Iron Giant's got a gun, bitch! It's not only insulting on that sense, it doesn't gel with the rest of the movie, which is just all about nerd cred and how you're not as worthy if you don't understand these pieces of media. And I think that is by far the biggest crime in the movie.
Right, absolutely. It's the worst kind of nerd. Not even really understanding the work and what it means, but getting the reference before other people and thinking anybody else who doesn't get it is below them or something like that. But, another ironic thing about the Iron Giant is that movie actually has just one big pop culture reference that's similar to, a repurposed, very big, pop culture reference that's similar to the way Ready Player One does, but totally and utterly understands the iconography of Superman way better than anything in Ready Player One understands the dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of references the movie makes, where there's a reference to Superman. This robot might have been programmed to kill and destroy. We don't know where it's from, but it learns to feel and care, and it, reads comic books with the main kid who he befriends and wants to be Superman and to protect. In a way, that movie understands Superman far more than any of the Zack Snyder Superman stuff has so far. And it's a pop culture reference, but it works so well. So it's kind of an ironic thing. Then the Iron Giant is used a pop culture reference that completely misunderstands the Iron Giant. And I guess my question is, does Spielberg and does Zach Penn, the screenwriter, do they both know that all these pop culture references are a misrepresentation of what these things mean? And this movie is sneakily satiric about our current obsession with just pop culture bonanzas and reboots and remakes and endless sequels. And I wonder if the movie is trying to comment on that or if I'm giving it too much credit, I guess is my question.
I would love to read or listen to a defense suggesting that. Personally, I struggle to find the evidence in the text or the subtext to suggest that beyond just a couple of hints that we'll get into a little bit later. I agree with you that the power of the Superman moment in the Iron Giant is because it understands it. And the one time I think that this movie really gets the pop culture reference right is when in the second challenge they do that kind of deep dive in The Shining. And it's representative of Halliday mirroring Jack Nicholson as this kind of obsessive personality that might not necessarily be helpful to those around him because of his obsession. It understands like what's great and what's scary about the movies. Like, it's just fun to be in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's so well crafted. I had been told about that part. I have a friend who worked on it. He said there's a part where they go into The Shining. So I knew about it for months leading up, and even knowing like that, and like that's the thing I was looking forward to most, still kind of blew me away in the middle of this kind of mediocre, weird pop culture reference, standard hero's journey thing. Just to have that sequence in the middle, and it just looks exactly like The Shining. Like it looks like they shot on the same film stock that Kubrick used, and it's definitely Spielberg playing in the sandbox of Kubrick, which he's already sort of done in AI. And like, but this is just him fully getting to play Kubrick, which I guess is part of what everybody's doing when they're in the Oasis. They're playing within their own pop culture obsessions. But like you said, he understands what The Shining is far more than other things in this movie, I guess.
The one thing I would say is really interesting to me about it, and when I initially saw it, I was kind of just like repelled by it, but talking to you, you made a good case. But that moment where you see the famous picture of everybody in the Overlook, but instead of Jack Nicholson, it's Halliday. And like I think that is like the nice little touch that moment needed to kind of like draw the themes home, even though it does make Halliday look like the creepiest fucking person on earth. Like if I saw that on somebody's wall, I would just be like, there's a lot of people on the earth. I could be friends with somebody else. This is weird.
Well, he also the end of that challenge is finding this woman he's obsessed with, who he went on one date with her, I guess, back in like now. I can't remember the timeline of this movie. It's like it should, because it takes place in the future. So I guess like the timeline would be around now. He went on a date with this woman and, really just weirded her out because he was just a total nerd and couldn't connect to her on a human level. Mm-hmm. And then his business partner ends up marrying the same woman, and he ends up firing his business partner later, probably because of personal jealousy. And then he traps a representation of this woman's consciousness in the Shining part. She is the key to getting the next key or egg or whatever the hell the MacGuffin is. And like freeing her from this weird hell where she's in this like ghostly dance hall, that's like doesn't look like The Shining. This little sequence at the end is sort of inspired by the idea that there's like ghost parties, but like not really anything specifically from the movie. So yeah, there's something so weird and creepy and off-putting, and definitely supposed to be that there's something there to like, oh, this guy's not such a good dude. This is like, it's not just a fun Willy Wonka figure here. He's kind of a total loser creep who's sort of realizing he wasted his whole life on pop culture references, instead of having a real life.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a tweet. I can't remember who tweeted it, and I wish I could attribute it. But it was a critic who saw it at South by, a few weeks before it came out. And they said, this is Spielberg's vision of hell, but he still wants you to have fun. And I think there could be something to that, maybe. But, like I said, I'm still not convinced. Like, I think that's an interesting read of the movie, but also because we're living in a dystopian future where everything's so miserable, people go to escapism. But then the end of the movie isn't about them realizing we need to save our world.
Yeah. I think that's interesting, and I think that you should have just taken credit for that thought rather than trying to rightfully attribute it to somebody else.
That's what the internet is, right? Nobody gives anybody credit for like their art or jokes or just.
Yeah, and I think that I think that that's an interesting read. I have a tough time going all the way with that read. Especially with, I think that it's not like explicit, but there's it's not ugly, but certainly not complimentary, kind of like trophy girlfriend aspect to Artemis. Like you win the game, you get the girl. That makes it feel less like considerate of that kind of dynamic, even though that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not true or not what they meant. But like when Parzival like meets her and she's like this beautiful woman with like a birthmark, and he goes, "I'm not disappointed." It's just like you're just like, come on, can we not be this movie?
Well, is she like the gamer nerd version of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl kind of, right? She's like, she's beautiful and she's really knows all the pop culture references almost as much as Wade does, but not quite as much, right? You know, like she's really good at video games and all this stuff. It's definitely a very fantasy-based thing. But she also is a freedom fighter while he just wants to win the game for himself. I guess that's part of his arc. And she's like, join this thing that means more than just you or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's not all bad, and I definitely think that is, you know, that's to the credit of the movie, is that they have that stuff in there, that, you know, it's a game that is, or it's a movie that is conscious of kind of who we need to be to make the world better, you know, which is why the kind of where the movie goes and what it does is interesting and compelling. And even though I'm ultimately, you know, humbug about the movie, like it still compels me.
Yeah, I find the movie fascinating, but not like great or good, necessarily. Do you know what I mean? I think it's a fascinating cultural signpost of our times right now, you know?
Before we kind of dig into the kind of the ending and that other stuff that we wanted to talk about, I want to just kind of like go a little bit more into just like talking about the Oasis in general.
Sure.
Just because I think that it's an interesting portrayal of a VR world, and that even outside of the references, you made that great point, you know, like the first thing we see is Minecraft world, but it's something that you can build stuff in.
You know, if people are into Minecraft, they'd still want to do Minecraft in VR, sure. So
Yeah. Exactly. But to me, it's just like a really interesting portrayal of, I don't know, of a video game, and kind of like the touchstones from video games that they drew, not necessarily the references, but like the economy and how basically Oasis bucks it has replaced all currency, it seems. And I don't know, to me, I find that to be an extremely disturbing portrayal of the world. Like, you know, like one of the first things you see is like there's a casino in there, and the idea of just like a place where people can just like ruin their lives in a second, and this world is ugly. The overall, you know, you see Wade's stepdad or whatever spend the entire nest egg on the house because he wants to get that one upgrade. It's interesting to me that it drew those elements, and even though like it's trying to pitch itself as like, though the Oasis is free, you know, that we don't want ads that would ruin it. I think that there's elements to that I think undercut it. I don't know. What's your response?
Yeah, it's weird. If you get killed, you zero out. There's like very strange rules, and I don't know. You can't just be killed at all times, I guess, only if you're playing in a dangerous game or something. But if your avatar dies, you lose all the money and upgrades that you've earned over time. And then I guess the money you earn can be used in the real world. Like when Wade wins the first key, he gets like a bonus, and then he uses it to buy, I don't know, what does he buy, a haptic suit or something like that, right? So yeah, it's very bizarre. There's definitely some sort of economy still going on in the real world. Like you see a guy at his office freaking out because he was playing, and it seems like not everybody is plugged into the Oasis. The other people at his office are still doing regular office jobs, and so I don't know if everybody works or no, it's just a select group of people are still working, or like we see it's very unclear this future. So yeah, like that seems to be the only type of economic incentive you can get as somebody who's not rich already. And it's winning money in this video game.
Exactly. And I think an important dimension to this is that not only is it, you know, you zero out, but it seems like there's definitely occasions where if you can't make it happen, the Oasis, there is VR slavery in this world.
Right.
You have
Yeah.
to go to the loyalty center, and you're just put in a cage, and you're made to, I don't know, like she was said, the only vision we saw of it is when Artemis had to plant the VR charges on the bridge,
Right.
which was a weird thing to do, but it's the kind of thing where I forget the details of it, but they the way they pitched it was that like once you get sucked into VR slavery, you can't work yourself out, even though the idea is you're working off your debt. And those are very powerful, fucked up concepts that I think aren't really weirdly addressed. And like I understand that every action video game movie doesn't need to have my sensibilities of, you know, shaking their fists at the world, but I think that this movie has enough signifiers to it. It's least at worst exploring.
Yeah, I mean that's the bad guys too who have this slavery, so it's obviously represented as this terrible thing. And then if they win, if IOI took over the Oasis, then you would presumably have a lot more stuff like that. It's not just that they'd be selling ads, but
and might as well transition into the kind of the ending, because at the end of the movie is through, you know, the power of friendship and teamwork and understanding your fellow man, Wade wins the challenge and shares it with his clan. So it's like a council, and so that's kind of like the moment. And the big changes that they make that are portrayed as setting the world on the right track is that they end VR slavery, which, no judgment, thumbs up. I think we can all get behind that. But the other thing is that they make everybody take 2 days off a week from the Oasis. So they are forced to live in this terrible hell world that they created for themselves, which is a weird choice, I feel.
well, I think the idea that we should live in reality is a good message. It's funny, I was just watching Vanilla Sky last night, which is like weirdly relates, even though the last 20 minutes that are literal just 20 minutes of exposition, that endless elevator ride. I don't know if all you listeners remember Vanilla Sky, but he has to make a choice to live in like a lucid dream technology, which is basically, I guess, some sort of VR, or live in the real world. And I think that is an interesting theme that the movie could have explored. But like you said, they kind of hedge their bets and like, oh, we turn the Oasis off for 2 days a week. But they're not making, you know, it's mostly Wade and his girlfriend making out, and not like trying to make this terrible world a better place, you know, so that's not implied at all.
I don't know, it gets to the heart of what I think is stuff that we feel today is, you know, we see the world, you know, it's the world is getting hotter. It's tougher and tougher to face optimism. Like, we all want something like the Oasis sometimes, where we can just go into, and we all do it. And so this movie resonates on that front, but then just being like, in the end, being like, the tech companies will disrupt enough to save the world, and we just need to go out into the world twice a day. I don't know. It just, in the end, it just feels like really underwhelming. And I'm open to arguments about it being more subversive, but to me, it just feels like, in the end, there's this worship of materialism, of these like references, and they say it's just like, yeah, just don't get too into it. I guess to me that it's a message that I find to be like very disheartening, because it is true. Like, I certainly don't begrudge anybody the stuff that they love, but even though I was overjoyed when I saw the glaive from Krull, like, loving Krull is not gonna really help or change anything beyond some kind of personal inspiration or catharsis to connect with something in the real world. And you need that thing in the real world beyond Wade making out with his trophy girlfriend, or having his like clan, like, great, I made my 4 best friends rich, for that message to feel like not ugly and not dispiriting to me.
Right, it almost would have been a more radical ending if, to save the Oasis, they would have had to destroy the Oasis, really, you know? But, like, everyone's a slave to this thing now, right? You know, beyond the people working for IOI. Like, people, and it's, you know, there's something very insidious about a giant corporation with a monopoly like this, with like the Oasis. Literally everybody is on the Oasis. There's no competition for it. I don't really know what their product is other than fighting to own the Oasis. Do they have a alternate, is it like the Windows 95 of like VR there that or the Bing, I guess is a better, like, just gonna rag on Microsoft more. It's like the Zune of VR they put out, so.
But yeah, and so, I don't know, to me, I like where this movie was going, and I almost thought, is this movie really going to make some kind of like bold statement about it? And I do agree that the ending is the crutch, because it's really building up, I feel, to some kind of specific message, like the way that Morrow talks about the responsibility that they have by making the Oasis. And, it may have started out as a game, but now everybody lives in there. And so there's supposed to be, some hints that, we need to understand and make decisions that take that into account. And they mention the quote from Superman. Some people can read War and Peace and come away thinking it's a simple adventure story. Others can read the ingredients on a chewing gum wrapper and unlock the secrets of the universe. To me, that's like it's like foreshadowing commentary on these references and stuff. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very strange use of that quote that doesn't really go anywhere. It's sort of like, I don't really know what it means in the context of the movie, because there's not a depth to this movie, but maybe there is. I think it's supposed to be about Halliday and the way he thinks. But, it's a very perplexing moment. Like, what are we saying here? Do you know what I mean? I guess, but I think ultimately Halliday is revealed to be sort of this sad, empty person who wasted his life. And to me, that's sort of the key of the movie.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the thing that's most interesting to me about where there's meat to talk about this movie beyond. Look, it's the Iron Giant. Look, it's Batman. Look, it's the Gremlins,
Exactly. Look, it's Tracer's ass, which was my favorite reference in the movie. I hooted and hollered. I know that you are less familiar with our filthy gamer ways. I forgot if I told you about that, but there was a big drama in Overwatch because of Tracer's poses being based off pinups, and you could see her and her ass was too prominent, and then they had a less prominent ass pose, and there was anger about that they reduced the ass level. To have that pose in the movie is just so immensely hilarious to me as somebody who follows gaming outrage. But anyways, I think it's a good time to kind of transition into maybe talking a little bit more about where this place is and kind of Spielberg's career and his interest in it, because that's what's most interesting to me. Because being baffled by the ending and it feeling not particularly resonant, it's difficult for me not to turn it inward and making it all about what's Spielberg trying to say? What does he see in himself about all this? It's obviously screenwriters. There's a whole team of people that make movies. It's not all Spielberg. But you look at something like War of the Worlds, which has a very kind of strong themes and messages while still being just in a lot of ways just a thrilling action movie. If Spielberg gets to say what he wants to say in most every movie these days, and I want to know what Spielberg is saying.
Well, I think there's a shallow, maybe there's just nothing to it. Here's the argument that there's nothing to it. He just thought it was a fun book that, and the movie did well here and did tremendously well overseas, and it's just a fun romp. Is the guy's been into video games since the beginning of video games, since the 70s. Since he first got famous, he had, the latest video games in his trailer. I remember there's a funny story where Kate Capshaw who he eventually married, was talking about when she tried out for Indiana Jones, his method of flirting was hey, I've got an Atari in my trailer. Do you want to come play it? So he's just a nerd. He's definitely a deep nerd, and this could have just been a fun romp. There's also, the book is chock full of not just references to pop culture, not just references to 1980s pop culture, but to Steven Spielberg properties.
Mm-hmm.
And to the credit of the movie, I think when he decided to make this movie, he felt like, I don't want to, be just self-congratulatory. So he basically removed all references to his work, except the DeLorean. But even I argue that's not the DeLorean, it's just a DeLorean. It's just a DeLorean. It doesn't travel through time. So how is that? But anyway, that's me being a nerd. So the Gremlins were not even his idea. I heard, my friend who worked on it said, yeah, they put the Gremlins in and then pointed it out to him. He's like, oh, that's cute. He didn't even approve that. They kind of put it in as an Easter egg, the effects artist. And then you could argue the T-Rex is the Jurassic Park T-Rex, but it's also just a T-Rex, so... and I think there's a lot more stuff in the book. Again, I haven't read the book, but it's just chock full of Spielberg stuff, ephemera, from what I've heard, So that's the shallow interpretation, right? I could see that. But I do think Spielberg has not gotten much credit for how subversive he's become over the last decade and a half. Maybe, oh my God, 2001, 9/11 was 2001, and I feel like he's gotten more cynical and subversive since then, and he sort of subverted the Spielberg happy ending. And so War of the Worlds is a great movie to bring up because that movie is so dark and so, depressing. I've never seen a movie that really is more about this is what the apocalypse would feel like, just this horror show where people are dying and society is collapsing, and it's not like a Roland Emmerich movie where the apocalypse looks kind of fun. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Will Smith is making quips. This is oh, everyone's dying and people are freaking out and turning on each other, and it's just absolutely horrific. And so that's not really the Spielberg that we knew from E.T.
I knew I wanted to have you on for this because I remember specifically our argument that we had, and I'm about to spoil War of the Worlds, but we had a pretty a lively debate about whether or not at the end he gets his kids, or his one kid, and his other kid turns out to have survived, to the mother's place, and they don't invite him in, and it's basically saying, It's awesome you save these kids, but you're still a shitty dad. You don't...
Well, you're still going to be alone in life. And yeah, exactly. And it's framed the way the end of The Searchers, which Spielberg is obsessed with John Ford, so that's not surprising. Mm-hmm. It's not a big sad ending. It's still the son who ran off to fight the aliens without really having any training or weapons to fight these aliens. Somehow survives. That kind of, you feel like he probably should have died off screen, but he survives. He gets Dakota Fanning back to the mother he's divorced from and the grandparents, but he's not invited in. I just thought that was an interesting moment in an overly happy ending after this super dark movie, that he doesn't go in, his place isn't inside.
It's a very dark twist for Spielberg's saccharine reputation.
Right, exactly. And the whole idea of everything he's ever made is always a quest for home, which is something sort of not present in Ready Player One, but we can go back to that. But yeah, he doesn't go in. He's framed by the doorway, just the way John Wayne is at the end of The Searchers, because his place is not inside, his place is back out, in the Wild West. There's also an ending to Minority Report that I feel like is never discussed, and I think it's telegraphed early in the movie. There's a part where Cruz goes to see where the pre-crime prisoners are kept, and Tim Blake Nelson has a line where he says, they're not moving, but they're always busy in their brains. They're dreaming and thinking, even though they're basically under... it's a very bleak, weird prison for people who actually haven't committed a crime. Mm-hmm. Cruz, is accused of a crime, goes on the run, gets caught, and then the movie completely changes style once he's caught. His wife, who he's separated from, breaks him out of this weird mind prison, and he exposes the person who was setting him up in a very pat, it feels like an old noir, but also kind of a very pat way. And then the precogs, who are also slaves, basically being forced to use their powers and exploited, are freed and put in this very pretty little cabin that's amber lit and looks very pretty. And my thought is that's all a fantasy in Tom Cruise's head. The movie isn't explicit about that, but it's sort of similar to the ending of Brazil. And that's what I've always said. If I ever got coffee with Steven Spielberg, the first thing I'd ask him about is the end of Minority Report.
I think that's a real interesting take. It's definitely the first time I'd ever heard that after reading a fair amount of stuff about Minority Report. And that gels with what we're talking about, is that Minority Report is the start of, it's not like it's never been there, but it's the start of a shift in Spielberg's tone that can be seen again and again and again in his later movies. And it's not every movie. I don't think Tintin or whatever has a dark secret, but to me, it's something that you can see. And so, bringing that to this movie, where the ending, where I'm just so puzzled, I'm just what is Spielberg trying to say? Does he see himself as Halliday here? Is this some kind of reference or discussion about his career? Is that an element?
I think there's no doubt that he's most compelled by Halliday. Whether, what he's exactly saying about him is unclear. I think it's similar to in Jurassic Park, John Hammond, who built Jurassic Park. He dies in the book in a pretty, spectacular fashion, at the end of the original novel. And Spielberg not only keeps him alive at the end of this movie, because this guy just has a twinkle in his eye. He's this master showman who kind of messed up by overreaching. By the sequel, which I just rewatched all these movies after Fallen Kingdom came out. The sequel, he's become a radicalized, this was a bad idea, we need to stop this. Mm-hmm. I want to protect the animals, but also I made a huge mistake by doing this. He's gone from a showman to a naturalist. There's actually a line about that Jeff Goldblum says to him. So I think he's most compelled by characters like that, these showmen, who are the visionaries. And I think the Halliday character is the most interesting to him for sure. And there's definitely many, many instances in this movie where it's implied that Halliday basically is a creator who hates his creation. They talk about that in the Shining sequence. He is a miserable man who did all these pop culture references, but really never lived a real life, right? He's never actually got married. All he did, his funeral is Star Trek themed.
Yeah.
There's no there. It's just pop culture, pop culture, pop culture. He built the Oasis.
It's Star Trek themed, but it's not even it's just a shitty funeral with the iconography there, and that listening to you talk, that could almost feel purposeful.
Yeah, I wonder if there's something there that he's saying about him looking back on his works, considering where we are right now as a society, just for real as a society, but also where we are now as a industry, a film industry, and video games, what everything is another sequel, the next Battlefront, the next Star Wars. We're already 4 new Star Wars movies in after being starved for good Star Wars content for so long. All of a sudden we're 4 in and, people are already getting tired of it,
Yeah.
Solo didn't do so well. So I don't know. And I think he's very acutely aware of that. He probably could have made a Star Wars movie if he wanted to, retelling these stories, or at least trying to find some new angle in these old worlds. And if that's how he feels, then we're dealing with a movie where he's actually looking back at the pop culture that he helped create and wondering where it's gotten us, and probably feeling a little bit of despair. And the ending could be a subversively sad, oh no, they didn't get it, they haven't actually done anything, they're just going to continue to make the same mistakes that Halliday made, and society is doomed to just tell the same stories over and over instead of telling new stories.
What you said about Hammond in Jurassic Park, I think, is absolutely true. These kind of grand visionary creators, that's obviously something that he grows to, but we're at the point now where Grandpa isn't going to live forever. He's really, it's more pointedly about him thinking about, his life and his impact on the world in a much more kind of like palpable way than, rather than it being an element in Jurassic Park. To me, that's the whole movie. There's the story, there's everything that propels you along, but in terms of the crux of why he's doing it and the themes, that to me is the whole thing. Of why Spielberg is attracted to it, and
Sure.
and that's the only thing that elevates it to something more interesting than the gatekeeping nightmare that it was before.
Right, exactly. And I wonder if he's commenting on it, or he could not be. I'm not convinced he is. Do you know what I mean? But I think there's a read on that movie where there's actually really interesting stuff going on beneath the surface.
There's kind of one thing I want to talk about, and maybe this plays into what you're saying, is that thinking about, sometimes it's not a fully understood dimension. I know that when we've been pals for quite some time, and at the start of our friendship, I had a much lower opinion of Spielberg because I bought into the kind of saccharine reputation that I think is earned but misunderstood. He's somebody that started out with a very kind of optimistic outlook. And even through his darker films, there's, I don't know, even if it's not some sort of effort to bring people together, there's the understanding that that's the way it should be. The search for home, the value of a single life matters. That sort of stuff. We were born around the same time as Halliday. There was that optimism was something very palpable, and it's starting to fall apart in a very real way.
Right.
Like really the shattering the trust of the country, just the way that there's just indisputable evidence that the world is just going to start boiling itself to death, and we're going to start to have climate refugees. And I don't want to like do a we didn't start the fire of why the world is ending. Do you think Spielberg is reacting to that, or even if he's not reacting to that, like just what are your general thoughts on that kind of shift?
I think 9/11 really fucked him up in a way that made him think about the world in new ways. And, it's not like that was his first dark movie. Like Schindler's List, which is an incredible film, and Saving Private Ryan, which has incredible sequences, were very dark, harsh movies, but also had hope. And I think he really was very, like I'd also say AI, which is pre 9/11, sort of subverts the happy ending in its own way. And it's sort of like a fake happy ending, but that's enough for the kid. Like, but I think it's really after 9/11. I think it really messed him up. And I think War of the Worlds and Munich, which is directly about Middle Eastern terror and how we react to it, and these endless cycles of violence, and it's really a conversation about that. And Minority Report was, I think, a big reaction to the Patriot Act as much as anything. I think he is somebody who is like apple pie Americana suburbs is his iconography, right? Like Stranger Things is just a direct ripoff of his whole thing, or his 80s work, right? And, like he's very much about like, we shouldn't fear the alien, like this alienness here is benign, his optimism might be faltering in a way that's like, that doesn't mean he doesn't believe we're capable of these wonderful things and family and love. And the American ideals, which I've always questioned myself, but I think he's a his two favorite artists is like John Ford obviously and David Lean, but I think that Norman Rockwell and Frank Capra are like two of the most influential artists on Spielberg's outlook on life and work. He's definitely, you could argue, he's an establishment liberal centrist, but I think he's had a lot to say about that, and I'm sure maybe I'm wrong, maybe he's like, no, Trump, he's good, like I'm good with Trump, like pretty sure, I'm sure he's gone to a party that Trump was at and they were buddies before this all happened, but I'm sure, knowing his outlook, I'm sure he's appalled. But I don't know if that means this could have just been him saying, I just want to make a fun movie, I haven't made a fun Raiders like romp in a long time, beyond Tintin, which didn't really translate, at least here.
I think that's a good overlook of it. I, personally, like I said, I would love to read any deeper looks arguing for something like that. I tend to lean more towards what you were saying, is that there were definitely elements that Spielberg responded to in Halliday and thinking about his career, but I think that, to me, it's more the romp, and that's why, in the end, it's kind of underwhelming. Like the whole time where you're just like looking at this is supposed to be post-apocalyptic, yet these people aren't boiling to death. My suspension of disbelief isn't working here.
Well, there's corn syrup droughts or something.
The coin syrup droughts and the bandwidth riots is like I try to go into even movies I think I'm not gonna like. I try to have that open mind, and that's where my open mind closed, is where at that line.
So one thing I do feel like going back to Halliday, that I think is an important distinction. Like, again, I haven't read the book, but I've read pieces that have like sort of talked about the differences. One of the big choices they made was, in the movie, it's implied that you're only going to be able to get, find these keys if Halliday's pop culture obsessions. And there's a whole part of the book apparently where they list how many times Wade has watched all of Halliday's favorite pop culture, and it's something like, it would be a lifetime. The number of times he's watched Ferris Bueller and stuff like that, and Raiders and Back to the Future, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But regardless, with the key, every key in the movie is actually something from his real life. I guess up till the last one, when it's about finding the hidden signature in the Atari game or whatever. But even that's supposed to have some sort of meaning. So I think just that act, changing it so it's about his actual human regrets and not just, I liked Back to the Future. It's like, I think that's a key to the movie being a little bit more about humanity and this guy's regrets that he was only living in this pop culture world, and a more important thing being real life. But then the end of the movie isn't Wade getting that, other than we should play a little bit less. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I do think that is a big argument for why, let's make it more than just pop culture references. Like, human experience is much more important than that.
What I'd like to just reference real quick, if you haven't read the book, is the second challenge in the book, as I understand it, is that he has to, word for word, recreate the dialogue from War Games. And there's like a counter that shows you how accurate you are going through the movie, like saying each line of dialogue exactly. So when you say that, it's not like it's not hyperbole. It's an absurd rote memorization of this stuff. And, Ferris Bueller is fine, but the idea of watching Ferris Bueller that many times, like, that sounds like a Twilight Zone hell ending. Kind of got, like, one last big picture question to round things off. Divorcing what Spielberg's intention was. The movie's reaction, and this happens a lot with people, is like, I don't see many people, and certainly it's not their responsibility, but this is not a movie where most people are ever going to care or consider these kind of deeper lessons. They look at it and they're just like, look, it's a Gundam, hooray! And, it's reductive, but I feel like it's really, really going for that. And it feels pandering. And my question to you is, like, I remember back during the election, there was this big thing about, like, in the Star Trek community about, like, Trump supporting Star Trek fans getting really angry that they were being iced out of conventions. And just, like, literally, like, actors from the show responding, being just like, fuck you. Well, this is not the show.
Yeah, exactly.
This is at all. You can't understand it. And it's just like, what the media means to you is ultimately what's most important, but there's also, like, it gets to a point where there's just, like, a misunderstanding of reading the intentions. And, like, can these kind of things that Spielberg is doing have any kind of, like, meaningful impact, or are they just Easter eggs for people like you and me to go, like, look, Spielberg's darker now at this part of his career, and it just doesn't matter?
I mean, I don't think it's the responsibility of the artist to make people get it unless you, because that's going to make it much less interesting if it's just lecturing us on whatever he's saying. I think that's what makes it more interesting. And then the people who are ready to unpack that stuff will unpack it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, you know, but I also think people read on a surface level. And I'm not just talking about these dumb, you know, like the conservatives who are mad that Star Wars is suddenly political, which is one of the most gobsmackingly stupid things. Star Wars has been political from the first frame of Star Wars. He was referencing Leni Riefenstahl when he was showing the Empire. It was very political. It's a very anti-fascist, very, you know, like, you know, idealistic, you know, 60s hippie, you know, like version of, you know, like vision of, you know, the good guys versus bad guys. It's like his loyalties have never been in question. Lucas and what he's trying to say, what he was trying to say when it was his. So being mad that Star Wars is political now is crazy. But, you know, I think people on our side miss out on what something, you know, like people are saying too, like just talking again about the Wolf of Wall Street recently. And it's just like mind blowing that people don't understand that movie is not a movie about how Jordan Belfort is awesome. That movie is about a morally bankrupt, soulless human being, but it's presented in a very entertaining way. And the fact that people didn't give Martin Scorsese the benefit of the doubt is just really depressing to me, you know? So, but it's not his responsibility to have an ending where Belfort's like, my God, I've wasted my life. You know what I mean? Like, that's not as interesting or subversive or, you know.
I agree 100% that it's not the artist's responsibility to do anything but, you know, see his vision, you know, for good art. I agree with that completely, and I also agree that The Wolf of Wall Street is a great-ass movie that's I would say it's barely even subtextual. It's like a horror movie about capitalism. It is like the excesses of capitalism and like the horror that happens to people.
Well, yeah. And also my favorite part is people who like it but say it's too long. It's like, no, it has to be long. You have to be exhausted by this. If it was like a tighter movie, it'd almost be like, that was really fun. But the fact that you're like your own soul is exhausted by the end of this film is part of the point, you know? So I don't know. Anyway, we don't need to go that deep into Wolf of Wall Street. I just feel like I don't think if Spielberg is saying what he's saying, like I think it's an interesting thing to unpack and try to find what he's saying. And his, you know, I don't think it would have made it better if he on the nose said stuff, but I also think the ending calls into question what he's saying. I agree with that though, you know, so. I think
I certainly wouldn't suggest to someone who has less than 200 followers on Twitter that Spielberg should do anything at all. But I'm just curious. I guess the question I'm trying to get at is just like, if that's not effective, what is? And do movies even have, you know, is that something we should even be looking towards? Is that the point of Ready Player One, about looking towards these things? I don't know.
And I wonder if Spielberg feels soul sick by where pop culture has gone and like how it reflects real culture, or he just wanted to have fun. And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. You know what I mean? But like, I think it's an interesting exercise to debate that. And there are people who might just listen to this and saw the movie and said, "No, it was just a dumb movie." You know what I mean? Like, I could maybe I'm over reading into this, but I think the man has earned the right to, you know, unpack what's there beyond.
Absolutely. The final, I guess, period on this question is, or the question mark on this question is just to compare it to something like Mad Max Fury Road, which is a film that is also just on its surface level extremely fun, but you know, you put it together, and it creates a conversation that's about more than the fun. It's about kind of like, you know, very much about how we treat women, how, you know, the world, how people engage with each other, and it's like a lot of interesting conversations have come from that. And I'm not saying that's Spielberg's duty necessarily, but like, and like, obviously not everybody can be George Miller, but it's just like, do we need to start thinking more about, like, just in terms of our media consumption and just artists in general, about how to make that impact? Or should we just, you know, just make what we need to make, or, you know, our visions, and, you know, the conversations that happen are the conversations that need to happen. I don't know.
Right. I mean, I think he's over the years said plenty, and had, made movies that have meaty discussions. And, I think we just had a pretty meaty discussion about this movie. So I don't know, like, there's something there to talk about with this. But yeah, I mean, my depressing answer as a filmmaker is like the cultural conversation is very, like, there's a big drought of that when we're talking about film, where people talk now with television. You know what I mean? And I think even less than a couple years ago, I feel like there's not as much TV everybody's talking about at the moment right now. Mad Men and Breaking Bad are over, and Westworld is not what everybody wants it to be, which is I think that's a similar text we could talk about too, about the simulated world and pop culture and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, we don't have time to go into that.
No, but maybe I'll have you back for that. Well, I'm telling you, Seth, if you want to see a cultural conversation that is shallow and terrible, you should check out video games sometime.
I mean, I do play Mario on Switch and it was awesome, and I have a PS4, and I will be picking up God of War once I'm moving in a week. So once I settle into a new place, I think I want to pick up a copy of that because I've heard amazing things, and I was real into those first two God of War games back in the PS2 days.
You don't have to defend yourself to these jackals. You've played Mario.
I think the one last thought I had on Ready Player One, I feel like I've expressed to you off pod, but I think one of the things that's interesting and it's understandable is Spielberg took out almost all the references to him that were in the book, but I almost feel the more interesting choice would have been to lean fully into it and make all these references to himself, because then he's really fully, not just to, talk about how cool E.T. is or, the aliens from War of the Worlds are, but to really be like, I'm now exploring my legacy and questioning everything I've made, and I'm the creator who is at least questioning my creation, if not hating it, and I think that would have been a far more interesting movie. And I know that was something the critic David Ehrlich said, and I thought, that's a really interesting point. If this movie had actually been not Spielberg just exploring pop culture that he influenced, but straight up, driving straight into it and being like, what is my legacy? That could have been a fascinating movie.
I agree wholeheartedly. So long as they leave in Chappie and Tracer's ass, I'm 100%.
Now I have to find Chappie.
My kind of final last word that I'd like to interject here is that I think you bring up a lot of good points about Spielberg in general, and about how it might be more interesting than it appears at first glance necessarily. But to me, also in the current society, like with the way I feel that there is, I don't want to say a misunderstanding, but I feel like there's elements of what he's drawing that are particularly uninspirational or distressing, like the over focus on materialism. This is a movie that feels devoid of spirituality if you're not talking about, if you're not showing the spaceships that are cool in the workshop. And I feel like, it's obviously not Spielberg's job at all, but it's a monument to that is really distressing to me, even beyond all those other things. And a monument that doesn't get, not even if it's not necessarily not getting it, to see it not be gotten, depicted on screen, and then to see everybody just be like, Iron Giant, yay, is upsetting to me. And that's not everybody. It's not necessarily the people that are watching it. And you know what? If you did enjoy that and you don't give a shit about the meaning of Iron Giant, like, who cares? Have a good time. I don't care. But
I think there is the movie could be a Verhoeven-y satire on all of this. It's possible to read it that way, but I'm not convinced. Do you know what I mean? So I'm like making these arguments, but I'm not fully convinced of them. I think that the movie's either this or that, and if it's that, that's awesome, but I don't think it fully gets there. Do you know what I mean? If it's the Verhoeven-y satire on our times and on our pop culture, then I think there's a lot, because a lot of people just watch RoboCop and think it's an awesome movie about a robot cop blowing people away when, it's obviously a very subversive film. And So if he's commenting on all this shallow stuff and saying this is a nightmare and I helped create it, then it's a fascinating movie. But like that one tweet said, he still wants you to have a good time. So
I think that it's a pretty good dissection of Ready Player One. I think we'll end it there. Seth, thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast. It's nice to have just an extended film conversation like the days of yore. So, Seth, where can people find you and your good content online?
I am at Infinite Seth on the Twitters. And yeah, you can find Night Owls on iTunes or wherever else you rent. Vudu, Amazon, you can rent or buy it there. And hopefully we'll be back on a streaming service sooner than later because we were on Netflix for 2 years, but a mere few days ago, our 2-year contract expired. So hopefully somebody else will want to pick it up soon.
All right, and I am Reese. You can find my excellent content at Your Very Good Bud on Twitter. Also, check out our podcast Twitter at VGATWTOE on Twitter, or, do what you want. I don't care. I'm not a cop. Thanks so much once again. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.